Hi friends, having a PCR will trigger a code red, but if we follow certain basic rules, we can end up getting very good results in the post-op period. Let's follow this case through and see how I managed it. It was a routine grade 2 nucleosclerotic cataract, and I'm making the capsular rhexis to around 4.5 to 5 mm in size using my Utrada forceps. And once I've got the capsular rhexis, which is nice and round and well centered, I perform the cortical cleavage hydrodissection, and you can see the fluid wave pass through with a gentle rise of the nucleus center. A gentle rotation is then attempted, and then the phacoemulsification is carried out. The direct chop technique is employed. I'm using a multi-burst mode of phacoemulsification using vacuum of 350 millimeters of mercury and a power of 30%. The bottle height is at 100 centimeters. Because the capsular rhexis size is aimed at around 4.5 to 5 mm, the pieces which I create are quite small. I make multiple small fragments which will enable me to mobilize it into the anterior chamber. Only one piece at a time can be mobilized in the anterior chamber, which means that there is lesser amount of endothelial damage. Now while I come to the last piece, something happens. The phaco probe is well into the anterior chamber. It's not as though the irrigation port is actually occluded, but while aspirating the last piece, there's a surge and there are folds in the posterior capsule, which I don't notice, and then when I just give phacoemulsification to remove this piece, I see that there is a small opening in the posterior capsule. There is a posterior capsular rent. So the minute you realize this, there is a code red that should be triggered off within you. You should take a deep breath and relax, and then before coming out of the anterior chamber, you form the anterior chamber with viscoelastic, with what is known as a viscofluid exchange. Make sure that you don't insufflate too much of visco, just enough to form the chamber. There are some small residual pieces. Try as best as you can to expel it using a visco expression, because this is the least traumatic way in which these pieces can be gotten out without putting pressure on the vitreoretinal adhesions or on the vitreous space, because the visco will keep the chamber formed. Now there is a piece that's gone behind the posterior capsule. It is deep, it is in the anterior vitreous, and also you notice that the anterior capsular rim is clearly visible. It is not damaged, and there is some residual cortex. The primary aim is to remove the vitreous from the AC. Therefore, you should proceed with anterior vitrectomy. Try not to extend the PCR or create a break in the capsular rhexis. Remove the nucleus fragments only if it is possible. Don't fish in the vitreous. The retina guides will do a much better job of removing it without compromising the visual acuity. Remove the residual cortex only after all the vitreous has been evacuated from the AC. Implant a 3-piece sulcus IOL only if the above requirements are met. Shoving an IOL with improper handling of vitreous and cortex will lead to a chronic inflammation and increased risk of CME and RD. Putting the IOL hook or by crook is not the final aim of the cataract surgery. If in doubt, you defer the IOL insertion, assess post-operatively, and then refer to a retina colleague who will not only remove the stray nucleus fragments but also implant the IOL with the SF IOL technique. I'm going to do an anterior vitrectomy in this case with a 23 gauge anterior vitreous cutter. 2 side port incisions are made. One is already there, slightly extended. Keep the irrigation portion away from the rent and keep the cutter in such a way that the cutting port is visible to you. Start the vitrectomy in the mid part of the vitreous. So remove the vitreous in the middle. This will immediately remove the traction on the vitreous space. Don't go fishing after the pieces. As the vitrectomy is done and with the suitable vacuum, if the pieces come towards a phaco tip, then it can be eaten up with the vitrector itself, as you can see in this particular case. As I'm performing the vitrectomy, staying in the center and trying my best not to extend the posterior capsular rent, the small pieces gravitate towards the vitrectomy cutter because of the vacuum, and then they are cut and removed. Once the anterior chamber is completely free of vitreous, you can see it by the ease with which cortex can be aspirated. Use the same vitrectomy cutter, turn off the cutter and increase the aspiration, and then use the vitrectomy cutter to aspirate the cortex in the IA mode. Sometimes when you have to remove the cortex, you may have to activate the cutter once you brought the cortex to the center, away from the rexus margin and away from extending the PC rent. You can see that in the cutting port there is no movement of the cutter, meaning that I have not activated the cutter during the aspiration stage. So then we need to address the cortex on the opposite side. So fill the anterior chamber with viscoelastic, just enough to form it. Don't deepen it too much. This will drive the visco into the vitreous. I tried the cutter, it was not aspirating well, and therefore I switched to a bimanual IA. So use the bimanual IA only after making sure that all the vitreous has been cut and removed from the anterior chamber. Make the capsular bag as free from all cortex as possible. Now, because the PC rent has extended to the periphery, it's not possible to round it off with a posterior rexus. Remember, it's not always possible to perform posterior capsular rexus. It will all depend on the size of the posterior capsular rent. Enlarge the clear corneal incision slightly for implanting the 3-piece lens. You may have to enlarge it to about 3.4 to even 4 millimeters. Now, as the 3-piece IOL comes into the eye, make sure that you deliver the haptic in the sulcus. Using a Y pusher, I am able to engage the loops in such a way that both the loops lie within the sulcus. The lens is slightly decentered at this point. I'm sure that the IOL is in the sulcus, so you just have to position the lens in such a way that it lies clean over the sulcus. You can see that there is a posterior capsular rent that has not extended with all the maneuvers. The anterior capsule, of course, is intact. Constrict the pupil with pilocarpine, and then you will know whether there are any stray bits of vitreous that are coming through the pupillary edge to the wound, because there will be peaking of the pupil as the pupil constricts. Of course, triamcinolone can be used at this point to ensure that there is no vitreous in the anterior chamber, but you can use the pupil also as a guide to make sure that there is no vitreous wick that is extended into the anterior chamber. This is the pictures that was taken just 15 minutes when the patient came out of the operating theatre, and you can see that the pupil is nice and round and the cornea is clear. So by following certain basic principles, you can actually get great results even if you have a code red and a PC red. Thank you for your attention.